In a world still filled with alarms, rushing headlines, and tensions that make it hard for the human heart to grow still, tonight we turn toward a man who could hardly follow any of the hurried rhythms of his age. Stephen Hawking lived most of his life in a body that was growing quieter and quieter. He could not walk swiftly down a corridor, could not raise a hand to point at the sky, could not speak his thoughts in a natural voice as others do. And yet, it was this nearly motionless man who helped humanity see farther into the places where light disappears, where time bends, where the universe seems to keep its deepest secrets hidden. There are lives that help us understand that strength does not always reside in movement. Sometimes, strength lies in the ability to keep thinking as the body slowly closes its doors, to keep asking questions as life becomes more difficult with each passing day, to keep looking upward even while one is being held back by the gravity of fate. And that is where Stephen Hawking's story begins. Not in the noise of glory, but in a gentle, sorrowful, and radiant paradox. As the body slowly falls silent, a mind begins to speak more loudly. If at this moment you are listening to me from a city where the sirens have fallen quiet, from a small room still warmed by a gentle light, from some corner of the world where the night can still breathe slowly, then deep sleep of power sends you the softest of greetings. And in an age when news of war, instability, division, and anxiety continues to wash across our screens one after another, we would also like to ask, very gently, where are you now? And is your place peaceful at this moment? Are you safe? If so, please stay with us a little longer. And if you cherish stories told slowly, deeply, softly, like a late-night lamp, please subscribe to support Deep Sleep of Power so that we may continue bringing you many more journeys like this one. Because tonight, we will not speak only of a scientist. We will speak of a man who turned fragility into another form of presence. While many are remembered for their footsteps, Hawking is remembered for his questions. While many lives are measured by the distance they travel across the earth, his life was measured by the vastness to which his imagination carried humankind. He helped the world think differently about black holes. He brought ideas that once seemed to belong only to blackboards and lecture halls into the living rooms of ordinary people. He made millions, even those who had never studied physics, want to lift their heads and wonder, where did this universe begin? What is time, really? And in the darkest place of understanding, might there still be a ray of light? But perhaps what makes Hawking's story touch the human heart is not only his intellect, it is that his life reminds us that a person's worth does not lie wholly in the smooth working of the body, nor in a strong appearance, nor in the speed of one's steps, but in the depth of what one dares to pursue, dares to preserve, dares to keep thinking about even when the darkness has already come to sit very near. And before he became a symbol of modern intellect, before the wheelchair and electronic voice became an image recognized around the world, Stephen Hawking, too, was once only a boy with a quiet curiosity, a boy who did not enter life like a prodigy from an old tale, but more lightly than that, more inward than that, like a daytime star no one had yet had time to see. If in the last part, we met Stephen Hawking as a gentle, sorrowful paradox of the modern age, a body gradually closing in while a mind was opening outward, then now we may step a little farther back into his earliest years, when there was not yet a wheelchair, not yet an electronic voice, not yet black holes, nor the great halls calling his name as a symbol of world science. We return to a boy. And the first thing that must be said softly but clearly, is this. Stephen Hawking did not enter life as a fairy tale prodigy. He did not appear in the stories of his early years as a child who astonished everyone at once. He was not the sort of boy who, at 3, had already memorized complicated things, who, at 5, left adults in amazement, who, at 7, was spoken of as a little miracle within the family. No, at least not in the way the public so often likes to attach to later geniuses, so that their stories may seem to glitter more brightly. Perhaps that is precisely why Hawking's childhood feels strangely close to us. He was not a flash of lightning cutting across the sky and forcing everyone to look up. He was more like a quieter kind of light, the kind that does not burst forth, but exists quietly, like a small lamp in the corner of a room, not in any hurry to attract attention. Yet if one sits beside it long enough, one realizes how enduring it is. Stephen Hawking was born into a family that valued learning, books, and thought. The atmosphere around him was not one of display, but of a certain kind of intellectual life that was slightly quiet, slightly serious, and at times touched by a very particular eccentricity. In houses like that, people do not grow up by the sound of applause arriving too early. They grow up among bookshelves, unanswered questions, and meals in which knowledge is not decoration, but part of the air itself. And then, within that atmosphere, the boy Stephen began to reveal the thing that would stay with him all his life. Not a desire to impress, but curiosity. It was a very beautiful kind of curiosity. Not curiosity in order to outshine others, not curiosity in order to prove oneself exceptional, but curiosity in a purer sense, wanting to know why things worked the way they did, why this moved, why that stopped, why one mechanism could function, why one structure could hold its order. It was the kind of curiosity that draws a child toward taking things apart and putting them together again, toward looking inside, toward tracing the invisible backbone of things. Many people pass through the world as though walking through a room where everything has already been arranged for them. They use objects. They live within ready-made rules, and they rarely stop to ask how those things were made. But there are children who are not satisfied with the surface. They look at a clock and do not see only the hour. They look at a machine and do not see only its use. They want to know what is happening inside. Stephen Hawking seems to have belonged to that small company of children. And perhaps it is here that the most important thing about his childhood begins to appear. Not an obvious brilliance, but a habit of mind, a way of living within thought, a natural tendency always leaning toward the question, why? And sometimes it is precisely people like that who travel the farthest, because life does not always require a dazzling beginning. Many great journeys are built from the quietest movements, a gaze that lingers longer than other people's, a question kept in the heart longer than other people keep it, a patience with what is not yet understood, deeper than most. That, too, is what gives Hawking's story such a particular comfort for listeners today, especially in an age far too accustomed to worshiping those who display success very early, very clearly, very visibly. Our age is often impatient. We like striking signs. We like to hear that a great person was unusual from a very young age, because it makes the story feel neat. It helps us believe that genius is something that can be recognized at once, like a mark already stamped on someone's forehead. But Hawking does not tell us that story. His life whispers something gentler and deeper as well, that there are minds which germinate not like fireworks. They do not explode across the dark sky. They grow like roots beneath the earth, silent, persistent, almost unseen, until one day the trunk has become large enough to hold up a piece of the sky. Hawking's childhood, then, does not need to be painted into a legend. It is more beautiful when left as it was, a season of gathering. A boy who may not yet have been dazzling, but who had already begun to train within himself a rare quality, to live nearer to questions than to answers, and that is the very quality that would later allow him to sit for a very long time beside mysteries that many others would only dare to pass by. There is another precious thing in the image of the boy Stephen. He did not grow up as a perfect model. That matters, for when we look back at great figures in history, we often flatten them, without realizing it, into polished symbols, as though from the beginning everything had been clear, orderly, and reasonable. But real life is rarely like that. An intelligent child may still be absent-minded. A sharp mind may still wear an outward air of indifference. An extraordinary future may still begin in years that do not resemble prophecy at all. Perhaps that is why Hawking gives us a sense of trust. He did not begin upon the stage of legend, but in a more ordinary landscape, where a person grows up with small interests, private habits of thought, and quiet traits that no one yet knows where they will lead. And there, the first lesson was laid down in silence. Intelligence does not necessarily arrive with noise. It may come like an underground stream. It may come in the form of a boy who is not especially dazzling, but who has the habit of not passing over what he does not understand. It may come in the persistence of an inner life that does not like to live superficially with the world. For the audience of Deep Sleep of Power, this is perhaps something deeply worth holding in the heart before going further into Stephen Hawking's journey. A person is not always rightly defined at the beginning. There are those who, in youth, seem ordinary at first glance, yet inside them a private order is already quietly taking shape. A private compass, a way of looking at life unlike the majority. And then with time, the years slowly reveal what was hidden at first. Hawking's childhood was not a radiant gate opening straight into glory. It was more like a quiet corridor. Along that corridor, a boy walked without much noise, without the sound of cheering following behind him, carrying with him only one thing that was very small and yet decisive. He truly wanted to understand. And sometimes, in the history of human intelligence, that simple thing is the most precious seed of all. Because later, when he entered wider spaces, ancient lecture halls, conversations among confident young minds, corridors where talent begins to brush against ambition, that quiet curiosity would not disappear. It would simply change its clothing. It would learn to speak through sharpness, through humor, through a very particular outward calm, as though the little lamp of childhood were now about to be carried into a larger building, where its light would begin to meet its first great windows. Leaving behind the early years lit by the quiet glow of a boy who loved to ask, why? Stephen Hawking stepped into a different world, larger, older, and more refined in the way it tested a human being. That place was Oxford, a name that sounds like the ringing of a bronze bell through the English mist, carrying something solemn, yet also something that calls to mind long corridors, staircases worn smooth by time, and rooms where so many generations of young people once sat in silence while nurturing ambitions not always spoken aloud. But what is interesting is that Stephen Hawking did not enter that place like a young man wearing the appearance of a theatrical genius. He did not make an impression through excessive seriousness, nor through a kind of diligence so visible that anyone passing by would nod in admiration. In the young Hawking, there was something lighter than that, almost absent-minded. He could appear with an air of ease, at times even a little careless, as though the machinery of academic life was not quite enough to fully occupy him. And yet behind that outward manner was a mind that was very quick, very sharp, and marked above all by a kind of confidence that made no noise. For the young, Oxford is often not merely a place to acquire knowledge. It is also where character begins to take shape. Some go there to shine through hard work. Some go there to shine through ambition. And then there are those like Hawking, who do not step into the center with a great deal of noise, yet gradually make others realize that beneath that calm surface lies a strangely steady axis of thought. In him there was intelligence mixed with humor. Not the sort of humor that tries to make others laugh through display, but a dry, fine, subtle wit. A very English kind of humor, like a cold breeze passing through a closed room, upsetting nothing, merely drawing a quiet smile from those perceptive enough to catch it. That kind of humor usually appears only in people quick enough to notice the distance between appearance and essence, between what people say and what they truly think, between the dignity of an elite environment and the deeply human absurdities hidden underneath. Hawking seems to have possessed that ability early on. He did not learn only with his mind. He also observed with the eyes of someone not entirely carried away by ritual. This made him distinctive, for in prestigious environments, many young people are easily made overly solemn by the atmosphere of reputation. They become rigid beneath the grandeur of the place in which they stand. But Hawking, in one way or another, managed to preserve a measure of inner freedom. He was intelligent enough to grasp the stature of knowledge, yet clear-minded enough not to turn himself into a youthful statue trying to appear great. It was precisely that mixture that formed the intellectual charm of his Oxford years. Sharp, but never showy. Confident, but without needing to declare itself. Humorous, but without thinning out depth. And perhaps this is where we begin to see clearly a quality that would stay with Hawking all his life. He was not easily overwhelmed by the setting around him. Some people are very gifted, yet when they step into a place full of other gifted people, they shrink inward. Some have talent, but standing among the long-established symbols of scholarship, they gradually lose their own voice. Hawking does not seem to have been like that. He did not need to resist the atmosphere of Oxford, nor to submit to it completely. He simply moved quietly through it, carrying his own way of being, like someone who had already understood that the value of intelligence does not lie in bowing too low before tradition, but in knowing how to stand within that tradition while still preserving an independent gaze. This does not mean that those years were entirely smooth, or neatly framed in a brilliance that was easy to see. On the contrary, Hawking's rather relaxed outward manner sometimes made it easy for others to misjudge him. A young person who is not especially industrious in the performative sense, who is not overly eager to prove that he is striving every minute, can very easily be taken for lazy, or for someone living by impulse, or at the very least for someone unlike the ideal student whom the world is accustomed to praise. But sometimes, that is simply how a distinctive mind works. There are minds that do not like to spend their energy on satisfying the impressions of the crowd. They choose instead to move more directly toward the core of a problem. In Hawking, people gradually recognized exactly that. His outward ease did not at all mean inward shallowness. Behind the calm exterior was a mind capable of grasping very quickly the essence of whatever was being discussed. And more importantly, he was not merely absorbing knowledge. He was beginning to show that he felt at home living with it. This was a very important stage of maturity. From the childhood of quiet questions, Hawking stepped into a youth of thoughts already able to stand on their own. There is a particular beauty in this stage of his life. It is the beauty of a potential that does not yet need to display itself in full. Like a fine instrument that has not yet played the greatest piece of its life. But with only the first few notes, a perceptive listener can already sense that the wood from which it is made is different. In that sense, Oxford was not merely the place where Hawking studied physics. It was also where the young man learned how to carry his intelligence among others without losing his lightness. He learned how to exist in a competitive world without turning himself into noise. He learned how to let sharpness live alongside wit, like a slender blade wrapped in soft velvet. That is especially precious for those listening to this story today, in an age when so many people feel compelled to strain themselves in order to prove they are exceptional. Hawking offers a different model. A person with real inner strength does not always rush to announce it. Sometimes they simply live calmly, learn calmly, speak a few dry jokes, and only with time do others begin to understand their true weight. But Oxford was only the first harbor of youth. Beneath those ancient vaulted ceilings, something greater was already quietly waiting ahead. For if here Hawking learned how to carry his mind with a quiet confidence, then in the next stretch of the journey, he would enter a place where questions were no longer merely academic exercises. They would widen into questions of the universe, wide enough that there were almost no walls to contain them, and cold enough that a young life could hardly know that while it was drawing nearer to the secrets of space and time, another darkness, too, was slowly approaching from behind, light as a hand resting on the shoulder in a corridor at the end of day. Leaving behind the ancient vaulted ceilings of Oxford, where Stephen Hawking's intelligence had begun to reveal itself through dry wit and a quiet confidence, we follow him to another threshold, quieter, deeper, and far more fateful. That place is Cambridge. If Oxford was like an overture in grey stone and bronze bells, then Cambridge in this story appears like a lower, more somber movement, where the still waters of narrow rivers seem to reflect not only old buildings, but also the greatest questions human beings have ever dared to place before the universe. There are places people go to in order to learn a profession. There are places people go to in order to build a name. But there are also places, very rare ones, where a person arrives and then, almost without meaning to, steps into a realm so vast that from that moment on, life can no longer keep its former shape. For Hawking, Cambridge was such a place. He came here to study cosmology, a field that sounds both distant and quiet, as though it belonged more to long nights than to noisy afternoons. Cosmology does not merely ask how a star functions or how a planet turns. It goes straight to the questions that make the human heart, if it truly stops to think, feel both small and astonished. Where did the universe begin? Did time have a beginning? Does space have an edge? And in a place where gravity is so strong that even light cannot escape, what is happening? These are not the questions of someone who simply wants an answer to place neatly on a shelf. They are questions that demand from the one who pursues them a patience, almost meditative in nature. One must accept dwelling for a long time with what is not yet understood. One must be steady enough to look into darkness without hastily turning away. One must be humble enough to know that one's mathematics however sharp, is still only a small lamp carried into a room far too vast. And at the very moment the Stephen Hawking stepped into that vast room, his private life was beginning to show the faintest signs that another door was slowly closing. Cambridge, then, is a paradox to both beautiful and sad within Hawking's biography. On the one hand, this place opened before him the widest horizon of intellect. On the other hand, it was also here that fate began to speak to him in a lower, colder voice, as though when a young man lifts his head to look farther than ever before, life quietly reminds him that his own body may not travel as far as he imagines. But before that shadow took on its full shape, let us pause for a moment in the Cambridge of those early years. Let us picture a young man walking across dew-damp lawns, through academic corridors where history still seems to breathe very softly through every stone. Around him was a world of formulas, of arguments, of ideas colliding like invisible stars. This was no longer the adolescence of scattered curiosities. This was the moment when the intellect had to choose. Either remain outside, simply admiring the grandeur of knowledge, or truly step within it, accepting trial, accepting solitude, accepting uncertainty. Hawking chose to step within. What matters is that he did not enter cosmology like a loudly enthusiastic man. He did not need to make himself the central figure upon the stage. In him, the movement toward great questions and seemed to carry something very natural, as though that mind had long been drawn toward things far removed from ordinary life. While many people spend their strength on matters close at hand, Hawking was drawn instead to those frontiers where knowledge begins to thin and mystery begins to deepen. Perhaps that, too, is the quality that distinguishes great minds from those who are merely intelligent in the ordinary sense. An intelligent person may solve very well the problems already set before them, but a truly exceptional person is often drawn towards the place where the question itself has not yet fully taken shape. They do not only want to know the answer, they want to know what ought to be asked. Cambridge gave Hawking the chance to live among such questions, and it is here, too, that we see in him a very important maturity. From a young man with a sharp mind and a calm manner, he gradually became someone willing to remain with questions larger than a single human life. When a person begins to think about the origin of time, the furthest edge of gravity, the birth of the universe, they no longer belong entirely to the small rhythm of everyday life. Some part of them has stepped beyond the shore of the familiar world. But fate often has its own way of testing those who are looking too far ahead. In his early years at Cambridge, Hawking began to notice a few changes in his body. At first, perhaps they were only things so slight that a young person would not wish to think much about them. A greater clumsiness than before, a movement no longer entirely smooth, a signal difficult to name. In ordinary life, people usually trust their bodies as they trust the floor beneath their feet. We walk, we stand, we grasp, we speak, and rarely ask ourselves whether one day these things might slowly drift away from us. That is why, when the body begins to send unfamiliar signals, the first response is often not understanding, but a vague unease, a slight refusal, a small hope that it is only fatigue, only temporary, only something that will pass. And while Hawking's mind was opening outward through equations, through scientific horizons, his body was quietly moving in another direction, the direction of narrowing. This is what makes Cambridge such an especially haunting chapter of his life. It is very rare for a human life, within the same stretch of time, to witness two such powerful movements in opposite directions. The sky within him was expanding, while the physical room of his body was beginning to grow smaller. Perhaps there are few images sadder and more beautiful than that. A young man enters the study of the universe, of the vastest thing human intelligence can touch, at the very moment when the finitude of his own body begins to appear. It is as though life placed before him two mirrors at once, one reflecting the infinity of space and time, the other reflecting the fragility of human existence itself. And between those two mirrors, Stephen Hawking began to step into a stretch of life that was no longer only an academic journey. It became an existential journey. The question was no longer only, how does the universe work, but gradually also, how will a human being live when he knows his life may not be as long as he once thought? But that was a door not yet fully open. It had only been left slightly ajar, just enough for the cold air to pass through, just enough for foreboding to begin touching the skin. Beyond that door lay the name of the disease, the early sentence, the first true darkness of Hawking's life. And sometimes, before night fully falls, fate always leaves behind a very long twilight. There are moments in a human life that do not arrive like lightning. They do not tear the sky into two halves, nor do they make everything collapse in one great crash. They come more quietly than that, like a chill passing down a corridor, like an invisible hand resting on the shoulder, like a small sentence that is enough to change the color of all the light within the mind. For Stephen Hawking, the early years at Cambridge had opened like a door leading into the widest reaches of thought. But in that same stretch of life, another door had begun to close. At first, there were only a few signs too difficult to name. Footsteps no longer entirely obedient, a few movements more awkward than before, small missteps that a young person would often prefer to ignore, as though by refusing to look too closely, they might simply dissolve on their own. But life can be patient in the way it sends back the same signal, until a person can no longer keep turning away. Then came the moment when Stephen Hawking had to face the name of what was quietly happening inside his body. ALS, a motor neuron disease, an illness that would gradually take away the ability to control the muscles, causing the body to withdraw step by step from the most ordinary movements of human life. At that time, he was still very young, at an age when many people are only just beginning to think of the future as a long field stretching before them. Hawking was forced instead to hear something like an early sentence, not merely the name of a disease, but a vision of narrowing, the narrowing of walking, the narrowing of speech, the narrowing of physical life, and most frightening of all for a mind just beginning to blaze open, the narrowing of time. We often think that the greatest fear upon hearing a grave diagnosis is the fear of death. But for someone like Hawking, perhaps the fear ran deeper than that. Not only the fear that one day he would no longer be here, but the fear that he might no longer have enough time to think through the things he was only just beginning to think. The fear that the questions only just taking root in his mind would be left unfinished. The fear that the sky only just beginning to open before his eyes would have its curtains drawn shut too soon. That is a very particular kind of sorrow belonging to the life of the mind. It is not noisy. It does not necessarily break into tears. It may simply be the feeling of watching the room around oneself become different. The objects are still there. The walls are still there. Other people are still talking, still walking, still living within the ordinary rhythm of life. But for the one who has just heard the sentence, space is no longer the same. Everything seems covered by a thin mist. The future, which only moments earlier had still seemed like a long corridor, suddenly becomes shorter, darker, and full of doors one no longer knows how many one will still be able to pass through. Stephen Hawking entered that darkness. And what makes this period touch the listener does not lie in how tragic it is, but in how deeply human it is. Because before such events, even the most intelligent person cannot at once behave like a symbol. No one receives devastating news and immediately turns pain into philosophy. First, there is always shock, always the loss of footing, always a silence within. Perhaps Hawking, too, tasted that. The feeling as though his life had just been pulled into another orbit that he had never chosen. The feeling of standing in the middle of youth and already having to see the shadow of limitation. And more bitter still, that limitation did not come from a decline of intellect, but from the body itself. The most basic vessel by which a human being is present in the world. The mind was still there, even growing sharper, but the ship carrying it had begun to fail. It is hard to imagine a more painful paradox than that. For if a person loses clarity of mind, they may not fully see the tragedy of their own condition. But when the mind remains bright, while the body gradually falls silent, a person must witness every small loss with great clarity. They must watch their physical life draw inward, while consciousness remains awake enough to understand what that means. That is why Hawking's illness was not only a medical trial, it was an existential one. How does one go on living when one's very lucidity makes fragility appear more clearly? Here, what deep sleep of power wishes to leave with you is not a feeling of despair, but the softly sorrowful truth that the first dark passages of life do not usually begin when a person collapses. They begin when a person is no longer certain how far they will still be able to go. And within that very uncertainty, many layers of the human mind quietly begin to appear. Fear, silence, the feeling of injustice, and also a very deep weariness. Not the weariness of the body, but the weariness of the soul when it must redraw the entire picture of the future. For Hawking, that picture had once been research, equations, years of an intellect still opening outward. And then suddenly, a crack appeared across the frame. No one can hear a prediction of a shortened life and still preserve the same feeling about tomorrow. From that moment on, every plan carries another question within it. Every dream must pass through the shadow of finitude. And so, very early, a young man had to learn what many only touch in old age. That time is not an endless field. Sometimes it is more like a candle set in the wind. And yet it is precisely here that Hawking's story begins to move away from the familiar shape of tragedy. For that first darkness, though real and deep, did not swallow him at once. It did slow him. It did make him fall quiet. It did change the color of the world around him. But it did not altogether erase the possibility that a human being might find meaning again. More precisely, within that darkness, a new question began to take shape. If my life may be shorter than I had imagined, then what still remains worthy enough to continue? If the future is no longer as wide as it once was, then what can still make me want to step into tomorrow? There are times when people are not saved by great ideas. They are saved by a reason that is nearer, a hand, a voice, a gaze that does not turn away from one's vulnerability, a feeling that even if this door is closing, somewhere there is still another door not yet locked. And perhaps it was at the darkest edge of this very period that the first warmth began to appear. not like a radiant sunrise, only like a small lamp lit by someone in a cold room. But sometimes, in the longest nights, a single lamp like that is enough to keep a person from entirely giving up the wish to remain. There are seasons of life in which a person does not rise again through some grand decision, nor because of any heroic call from the outside. They return more slowly than that, more quietly than that, like a branch thought to be dry. Yet in some deep joint, the sap is still flowing, like a room that has just passed through winter, not yet fully warm again. But on the windowsill there is already the beginning of a thin line of sunlight. After the ALS diagnosis, Stephen Hawking passed through a first darkness. A darkness that lay not only in the medical prognosis, but also in the feeling that his life had suddenly been narrowed far too early. For many, that might have been the point where the story ended. A youth just beginning to open out, suddenly meeting a wall, a future only just taking shape, suddenly covered by finitude. But Hawking's life did not stop there, not because he immediately turned into a symbol of courage, nor because fear suddenly disappeared as though it had never existed, but because while the darkness had not yet fully withdrawn, a few deeply human things came close to him: love, meaning, and a reason real enough to continue. Human beings are not always saved by great theories. Sometimes they are saved by a presence, by the fact that someone sits beside them without turning away, by the feeling that one has not yet been completely cut off from the world of things worth living for. In Hawking's story, Jane Wilde entered at precisely such a threshold, not like a miracle that erased all pain, but like a small lamp in a room still cold. Her presence did not make the illness disappear, nor did it make the future easy, but it returned to life something of immense importance, the sense that tomorrow might still carry some meaning. Love in those years should not be told as something romantic, merely for the sake of beautifying the story. For Hawking, it was more practical than that, deeper than that, and far more enduring. It was a form of companionship before it was ever a symbol. It was one human being seeing the most fragile part of another, and still not turning away. It was someone understanding that before her stood not only an intelligent young man, but also a soul, upon whose shoulders fate had placed a burden far too early. And instead of stepping back, that person remained near. It is here that we see a truth both gentle and strong. Many times, people go on living not because they have solved all their fears, but because they have someone with whom to live through those fears. For the older audience of Deep Sleep of Power, this is perhaps something very familiar. For after enough years, we understand that sheer willpower is not always the strongest bridge. There are days when what keeps a person tied to life is not courage spoken in beautiful words, but simply a hand resting on one's own, a meal shared with another person at the table, a gaze that lets us know we still belong to this world. Stephen Hawking, in that sense, did not surrender at once, not because he had failed to see the abyss, but because from beyond that abyss, there still came the call of human attachment. Love did not heal the illness, but it prevented the illness from becoming the entire definition of his life. It reminded him that beyond ALS, beyond those cold predictions, he was still a human being with the ability to love, the ability to be loved, the ability to bind his future to another person. And when love arrived, meaning also began to return. This is a very subtle movement in Hawking's life. Before that, the diagnosis had made time itself seem to contract. The future was no longer a long road, but more like a dim corridor, perhaps ending far sooner than a young person would ever imagine. In such a condition, it becomes very easy for every plan to lose its color. Very easy for the mind to ask, what is the point of trying if time may no longer be enough? But precisely when his emotional life was reconnected, that question slowly began to change its form. It was no longer, would it be of any use, but became, if there is still time, what do I want to use it for that is truly worth it? That was an immensely important moment, because from here, Hawking was no longer merely surviving a diagnosis. He was beginning to recover a reason to live with direction, and that reason lay on both sides at once, on the private side of love and on the vast side of thought. Science, for Hawking, was no longer merely a promising professional path. After the shock of illness, it became something worthy of pouring the rest of his life into. When people know that their time may be shortened, they often see everything more clearly. Trivial things begin to fall away on their own. Unnecessary roles begin to fade. What remains, more often than not, is only what truly carries weight. For Hawking, that weight was the great questions he had already begun to enter: the origin of the universe, the nature of time, gravity, and the darkest frontiers of human understanding. One might say that adversity itself clarified the center of his life. Before, he had been an intelligent young man with many possibilities, but from this point on, that intelligence took on an entirely different kind of focus. It was as though life, in its own cruelty, had forced him to choose the most essential part of himself and hold on to it. There was no longer much room for delay, no longer much space for half-hearted things. The more aware he became of limitation, the more he needed to give the time that remained the shape of meaning. And here, we find a very deep sleep of power kind of beauty. A human being does not always defeat darkness by driving it away. Sometimes, they learn how to live beside it without allowing it to rule the whole interior life. Hawking could not erase the illness, nor did he turn pain into a heroic anthem, but he began to place other things beside that darkness: intellectual work, love, commitment, and a growing awareness that his life could still carry immense value. That is a soft yet profound lesson for our age. In our world, people often praise strength as something that must be immediate, decisive, and radiant. But real strength, many times, is simply the ability not to give up in the days when no clear way out can yet be seen. It is keeping for oneself at least one reason to wake up. It is accepting that one is not yet well and still refusing to abandon tomorrow. Stephen Hawking lived those years in just such a way, not surrendering at once, not denying fear, not pretending he was not in pain, but little by little, gathering back the fragments of meaning he had thought were lost. A companion, an intellectual purpose, a future that might not be as long as he had hoped, yet was still enough to offer something of worth if he knew how to hold it. And then, once his inner life had found a point of support again, he could return to the questions that had long been waiting for him. Only now, he no longer looked at them as a student simply entering a new realm of knowledge. He looked at them as a man who had learned how finite his own life might be. And sometimes, it is precisely those who have come very near the limits of themselves who are able to remain the longest beside the limits of the universe. As though after a very deep winter, that hand were beginning to open once more, the window looking out onto the night sky, where the great questions still lay in silence, beautiful and dark, waiting to be named. after passing through the stretch of life in which Stephen Hawking learned not to surrender at once before the darkness. The story now needs to step back a little farther, not to move away from him, but to see the intellectual sky he was about to enter. For no one can truly understand Hawking's stature without understanding where the scientific world stood before he added his own voice to it. A new voice, however small, becomes strange only when it sounds within a room that has already been silent for a very long time. And that room, in the middle years of the 20th century, was cosmology. It was a field both beautiful and cold. Beautiful because it speaks of the greatest things the human mind has ever dared to touch: the origin of the universe, the structure of space-time, the fate of stars, and the vague yet persistent question that clings like mist upon a window pane. How did all of this begin? But it was also cold, because the farther one went into it, the more one saw that what we knew was still only a few small candles in a very wide night. Before Hawking, humanity had already had Albert Einstein, the man who changed, at its roots, the way we understand gravity. Before Einstein, many imagined gravity as an invisible force pulling between objects. But Einstein opened up an image deeper than that, and more beautiful as well. Matter does not simply attract matter. Space and time themselves are bent around it. In other words, the universe is not a flat stage upon which planets and stars merely move. The fabric of the stage itself is soft. It sags. It changes shape according to the mass of the things resting upon it. It was a majestic idea. It made the night sky no longer just a distant expanse, with points of light hanging still upon it. It turned the universe into something more living, more supple, more mysterious. And along with that change, scientists began to see before them a new precipice. Not a precipice of despair, but a precipice of understanding. From here, if we continue, we may see things no one has ever seen before. But it is also here that the familiar laws begin to grow thin. For when Einstein's general theory of relativity opened a door, it also drew behind it questions that Einstein himself, and even the generation after him, could not easily answer in full. If space-time can bend, then how far can it bend? If matter is compressed under immense gravity, where does it go? Has the universe always existed, or did it once begin? And if it did begin, what does that beginning mean, when time itself is part of the universe? This is where cosmology became a beautiful and dark abyss. Beautiful, because never before had humankind stood so near to such first-source questions. Dark, because the nearer we came, the more powerless our ordinary tools of intuition became. Human beings are born to understand a falling apple, flowing water, a room, a road, a lamp. We are not born to easily picture time itself, bending, or a star collapsing into itself. And so, every step forward in modern physics has felt like a step out of the familiar house of experience and into the windy night. Within that setting, some scientists began to move toward the edge of the most extreme questions of all. One of them was Roger Penrose. He did not look at equations merely as dry symbols. He looked at them as traces of something immense hidden behind them. Penrose helped show that if matter collapses under sufficiently strong gravity, it does not simply shrink in an ordinary way, but may move toward an extreme state where our usual descriptions begin to break apart. Put more plainly, the familiar map of physics seems no longer to have enough paper left on which to continue drawing. And it is precisely here that Hawking would enter. But before he steps forward, we need to pause with the feeling of that era. Imagine the scientific world as standing on the edge of a cliff at night. Behind them lies the land already known. Classical mechanics, observational astronomy, the brilliant successes of physics in explaining the familiar world. Before them lies a beautiful darkness, a place where space-time itself may be born, bent, collapsed, and perhaps even swallow the very concepts upon which human beings rely to understand reality. That feeling was both alluring and frightening, for science at its deepest level is not only a journey in search of answers, it is also a journey of accepting that there are thresholds where the question becomes sharper than any answer we currently possess. The scientists of that period were not standing before a field already plowed, waiting only to be harvested. They were standing before a frontier, a region where mathematics began to point toward things that seemed almost absurd: infinite density, infinite curvature, points at which the ordinary language of physics no longer moved smoothly. For listeners today, especially those unaccustomed to formulas, we may think of it simply this way. Before Hawking, the scientific world already knew that the sky was not at all as quiet as it appeared. They knew the universe had a history. They knew gravity not only kept planets in orbit, but could become an immense power, bending the very underlying structure of reality. But they still did not truly understand what happened at the furthest extremes, where a star dies, where light itself may be held captive, where collapse seems to go beyond every ordinary form of imagination. That is what makes this period so special. It is like the moment when a person has reached the edge of the sea late at night. We hear the waves, we smell the salt, we know that before us stretches a boundless expanse, but we cannot yet clearly see what is moving beneath the surface. Science at that time was much the same. It had already smelled the mystery. It had already heard the sound of something immense, but the light was still not enough to illuminate it completely. And perhaps that is exactly why Hawking appeared at the right moment. Not to enter a science already complete, not to add a few bricks to a building already finished, but to arrive when the ground was still trembling, when the questions were still open, when the previous generation had already seen the edge of the abyss, but had not yet descended all the way into that darkness. This is what makes Hawking's journey both beautiful and fateful. He did not come to knowledge as the heir to a stable inheritance. He came like a young man entering a room where the map still lay unfinished upon the table. The ink had not yet dried, and beyond the window stretched an entire sky still unwilling to reveal all its secrets. From here, the story will no longer be only about the setting. It will go deeper into the very mystery that kept scientists standing at that dark edge, the extreme points where familiar order begins to crack. Just as when we look at a piece of cloth pulled too tight and see the first thread snap free, physics too was about to reach a place where the old seams could no longer hold the original shape. When human beings stand before the deepest frontiers of science, what causes them to hesitate is not always complete darkness. Sometimes, what is more unsettling lies here. We can still see a little, still read a little, but the more we look, the more we read, the more the familiar signs begin to warp. It is like someone holding a map they have used for many years, only to discover that the paper has torn at the edge ahead. The familiar roads are still faintly printed behind them, but the part needed for the journey onward is no longer intact. A singularity, in a very plain-spoken sense, is the place where physics falls into that feeling, When people hear the phrase singularity, they often imagine something far too distant, far too abstract, something that belongs only to blackboards and to people who speak in difficult symbols. But if we remove some of that layer of formulas, the central idea can be felt through a very simple image. It is the place where the laws we usually rely on to understand the world begin to lose their full voice. Like an instrument that has played well through a long stretch of music, but when it reaches a note pulled too tight, the string suddenly produces a broken sound, not because the music has disappeared, but because the old instrument is no longer strong enough to hold that note. Modern physics, before touching a singularity, had already achieved many astonishing things. It explained the motion of planets, the light of stars, the structure of the atom, the curvature of space-time. It allowed human beings to look at the sky, not only with their eyes, but with an understanding that had grown ever more refined. But then, in places where gravity becomes extreme, where matter is compressed too strongly, too deeply, the equations begin to point toward a threshold that leaves one silent. Density may rise toward something almost infinite. The curvature of space-time, too, moves toward infinity. And when that infinity appears, the scientist understands that they have touched a strange edge. Not the edge of the universe, but the edge of the very language of description. Put more briefly, a singularity is not necessarily a mysterious object one can point to, as one points to a stone on the road. It is a sign that the familiar model by which we understand things has been stretched to its limit. To picture it more easily, we may think of a piece of cloth. Normally, when the cloth is stretched gently, every fold, every line, every pattern can still be seen clearly. But if someone keeps pulling it tighter and tighter, to an extreme point, the threads begin to warp, then split, then no longer hold their old shape. Not because the cloth itself is evil or mysterious, but because we have reached the place where the familiar structure can no longer bear the strain. It is the same with physics. A singularity is the place where the frame used to understand reality begins to crack. And it is here that Stephen Hawking revealed a very distinctive intellectual quality. He did not turn away from that crack. Many gifted minds prefer to work in regions where the structure is still clear. They solve difficult questions, but they still prefer questions that remain inside a room where the light is on. Hawking, together with people like Roger Penrose, dared instead to remain for a long time where the darkness was beginning to deepen, where science itself had to admit that it did not yet possess enough language to fully say what was happening. That is a kind of courage belonging very much to the life of the mind. Not noisy, not theatrical, but deep. For to remain with singularities, a person must accept a very uncomfortable feeling. The feeling of being intelligent and still not yet able to understand completely. For those listening to this story before sleep, perhaps there is no need to keep all the phrases like infinite curvature or infinite density in mind. We only need to keep hold of this. Scientists had come to a place where the laws that had helped them understand everything else were beginning to falter. And it was precisely there that Hawking realized that these extreme points were not merely mathematical dead ends. They could be keys to the greatest questions of all. Does the universe have a beginning? If so, in what sense did it begin? Where does a collapsing star go? And might there be regions of reality where familiar concepts like before, after, inside, and outside are no longer simple at all? Hawking's beauty lies in the fact that he entered these questions not only through formulas, but through disciplined imagination. He knew that physics is not a game of completely free imagination, but he also understood that if one does not dare to imagine beyond the intuitions of ordinary life, one cannot step toward the next frontier of understanding. Perhaps that is why his life later touched such a wide public. Within him, there was always a rare combination of the rigor of mathematics and the ability to see behind symbols a very large picture. Singularity, in the end, is not only a matter of dark objects out in space. It is also a very deep reminder of human limitation. We usually live by familiar things, light and dark, near and far, before and after, large and small. But reality does not promise that it will always fit neatly inside the intuitive tools we carry from everyday life. There are places where, if we go far enough, that original simplicity will no longer be enough. And that is not a failure of intelligence. On the contrary, the discovery of the old model's limit is itself a sign that intelligence is truly touching something larger than itself. This also makes Hawking's story profoundly suited to the spirit of deep sleep of power. For he was not the kind of figure who triumphed by making everything instantly clear, smooth, and easy to understand. He was the kind of person who dared to sit for a long time beside what was not yet clear, who dared to look into the place where the familiar laws begin to crack in their voice without hastily covering his ears, who dared to remain at the edge where science itself had to begin speaking more softly, more slowly, admitting more fully what it did not yet know. In ordinary life, we too have our own small singularities, moments when our old experience is no longer enough to explain what is happening, times when loss, illness, age, or change cause the laws by which we have long lived to loosen unexpectedly. Perhaps that is why older listeners may feel this part in a very particular way. For after a long life, we understand that not everything can remain within the frame already known. Sometimes, a person must live through regions where even their familiar language begins to waver. And there, what helps us continue is not absolute certainty, but the ability to sit still long enough to learn a new way of understanding. Hawking did that with the universe. He entered the place where the map of physics was beginning to tear, and instead of turning away, he tried to listen to what that very tear was saying. Perhaps that is one of the clearest signs of genius, not merely solving well what has already been set forth, but recognizing that at the very place where old knowledge breaks open, a new door may be beginning to open. And once a person has stood long enough before the place where the familiar laws begin to falter, the next step becomes almost natural, to look toward one of the objects that makes that feeling most powerful, not because it merely swallows things, as popular imagination often says, but because it becomes a test for the whole imagination of science. Like a dark well into which the longer we lean to look, the more the sky within it seems deeper still than the sky above. When black holes are mentioned, most of us tend to carry a very quick, very powerful, and very memorable image. A gigantic, dark hole that swallows everything passing near it. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is only the simplest shadow of a reality far more complex. For Stephen Hawking and for modern physics as a whole, a black hole is not merely a frightening object lying somewhere in the universe. It is a test for human intelligence, for the endurance of mathematics, and especially for our capacity to imagine when standing before things that can scarcely be seen directly. Perhaps that is also what makes black holes so compelling. Human beings are accustomed to trusting their eyes. We trust a lamp because we see it shining. We trust the rain because we feel the droplets touch us. We trust the earth because we step upon it every day. But a black hole stands on the opposite side of that habit. It is something so powerfully present that it distorts the very region of space around it, and yet it is bound to the impossibility of being seen. It is as though the universe, in one very strange moment, placed before humankind a riddle shaped like darkness. In very plain terms, a black hole is a place where gravity is so strong that even light cannot escape. If we stop only at that sentence, however, we still do not arrive at what truly drew Hawking in. For what really matters is not only that it pulls very strongly. What matters is this: once light can no longer come back out, many of our ordinary ways of understanding observation, information, and the very shape of the world are challenged as well. In human life, light is almost the most faithful messenger reality has. We know where an object is, what color it is, what shape it has, how it is moving, largely because light carries that news to our eyes. But a black hole is like a region from which the messenger cannot return. And when that happens, science is forced to ask, if light cannot bring news from inside back out, what can we still know about the interior? And if we cannot know, then where does our knowledge end? It is precisely here that the black hole moves beyond the image of a swallowing pit and becomes a frontier of understanding. Hawking entered that frontier not as someone attracted to darkness, simply because it was mysterious. He went there because a black hole is where many layers of physics collide with one another. There is extreme gravity there. There is the question of singularity there. There is the boundary between what we can still observe and what we can no longer reach by familiar means. In other words, the black hole is the place where the universe compels human beings to use imagination in the most serious way. Not imagination for the sake of fantasy, but imagination in order to keep going when ordinary intuition has reached the end of the road. This is why we should look at black holes with a slower attitude. Imagine a river. Far away, there is a whirlpool so powerful that every leaf drifting into it disappears from sight. The person standing on the bank is not astonished only by the force of the current. They are also unsettled because beyond a certain point, whatever enters can no longer come back and tell what happened. A black hole creates exactly that feeling for science. It is not only frightening because of its power, but astonishing because of the silence it imposes upon information. And it was precisely that silence Hawking refused to accept too quickly. There are minds which, upon meeting a dark region, stop at merely describing its boundary. But Hawking belonged to another kind of mind. He wanted to know whether behind that appearance of absolute silence, there was truly complete muteness. He looked at a black hole not only as the end of light, but as a test of whether the laws of nature might still have something more to say at the edge of what seemed unspeakable. Here we begin to see clearly one of his two most distinctive qualities. Hawking was not merely intelligent in the sense of solving difficult problems. He also possessed an imagination capable of walking alongside discipline. That is very rare, for if one has imagination without mathematics, one can easily drift into groundless, poetic dreaming. But if one has mathematics without imagination, one may move with great precision and still never dare to step toward the boldest questions. Hawking had both. He dared to think about regions others still hesitated before, yet he never abandoned the rigor of science. Perhaps that is why the black hole, in his story, becomes such a deep sleep of power image. It is darkness, yes, but not darkness that exists to end the story. It is darkness that asks us in return, how far can human intelligence truly go? When the old guiding light is no longer there, do we still dare to keep walking? When faced with something that seems only to swallow and remain silent, do we have enough patience to wait for a new language to appear? For older listeners hearing this now, the black hole may also stir another feeling, one closer to human life itself. For in every life, there are periods that resemble such a dark region, losses that pass through us without leaving behind a complete explanation, questions we send into time and receive no answer to, things that seem to have been swallowed out of our lives. But it is precisely there that human beings are tested, not only in endurance, but also in spiritual imagination. Do we dare believe that silence is not yet the whole story? By looking into black holes, Hawking seems in some way to have lived that truth again on a larger scale. He did not separate himself from the darkness. He sat before it, observed it, thought about it, challenged it with questions. And because of that, the black hole was no longer merely a symbol of devouring. It became a narrow door through which physics was forced to renew itself. The deeper Hawking looked into black holes, the closer he came to a discovery that would change the way human beings understood that very absolute blackness. For sometimes, the strangest thing about the universe does not lie in how dark its regions can be, but in the fact that at the very edge of the deepest darkness, there may still exist a very small whisper, like standing beside a window late at night and thinking that beyond it there is nothing but solid blackness, only to find that within that darkness itself, a thread of light, so fine as to seem almost unbelievable, has begun to leak out. If the black hole, in the ordinary imagination, is a symbol of devouring, of silence, of a dark region into which light goes and does not return, then the discovery associated with Stephen Hawking's name is like a small bell ringing out within that very silence. It tells humanity something at once deeply scientific and richly poetic. Even the place we imagine to be absolutely black is, it turns out, not completely mute. That is what the world would later call Hawking radiation. Hearing the name, many people easily picture something very dry, very technical, something meant only for physicists accustomed to living among formulas. But if we sit down quietly and gently remove some of the mathematical clothing from it, the beauty of the idea can enter the human heart in a very soft way. What Hawking proposed in 1974 was that black holes are not entirely black in an absolute sense. Near the event horizon, the boundary beyond which light no longer escapes as before, quantum effects can cause a black hole to emit a form of radiation, and therefore, very slowly, over a very long time, it may gradually lose mass as time passes. Put in the simplest possible way, the thing we imagined only knew how to hold everything in turns out also to be letting out a faint little voice. This is one of the most beautiful moments in modern science, not only because it was new, not only because it was bold, but because it happened precisely in the place where surprise seemed no longer possible. When human beings looked at a black hole, intuition usually suggested that it was the end point of visible information, the slammed shut door of light. But Hawking dared to ask a different question. Might nature, at the very edge of that absolute darkness, still be doing something subtler than we had imagined? To feel the full stature of this idea, we should remember that Hawking did not merely add a small detail to the story of black holes. He compelled physics to reconsider the very picture it held of the universe's silence. Before that, black holes had been thought of as entities that could almost entirely only pull inward. After Hawking, that picture could no longer remain intact. It was as though we had looked at a dark room and believed all its windows were sealed shut, only to discover that through some tiny crack there was still a current of air and a thread of light moving in and out. The beauty here lies not only in the conclusion, but also in the way Hawking arrived at it. He stood at the meeting point of two great worlds of physics. On one side, Einstein's gravity. On the other, the quantum world of the very small. In ordinary life, we are used to thinking of the very large and the very small as different things. Things that rarely touch one another. But Hawking looked into the place where they meet at the edge of a black hole, and it was there that he saw the old picture was missing something. This shows that he was not merely a gifted mathematician. He was an intellect capable of remaining for a very long time at the place where great theories begin to rub against one another. Many people learn one system of thought and then live within it. Hawking was different. He stepped into the very place where those systems were no longer self-contained, where they had to listen to one another, collide with one another, and even reveal surprises that no one had dared to trust at first. For listeners hearing this story before sleep, there is no need to force ourselves to fully understand every quantum detail in order to feel the meaning of Hawking radiation. We need only keep one image in mind. The black hole is no longer an absolutely dark, tightly sealed object, as the first imagination suggested. At its edge, there is a motion so subtle that human beings must use a very disciplined imagination to notice it. And it is precisely that subtle motion that shakes an old belief, that complete darkness must mean complete silence. In truth, in the deeper layers of life, this is also a profoundly comforting idea. For all of us, sooner or later, pass through our own black holes, periods in which everything seems to be swallowed away, moments when strength, faith, or the future itself appears to contract into a darkness difficult to name. In such times, what makes us despair most deeply is often not only the pain, but the feeling that nothing is speaking anymore. No signal remains, no way out remains, no reply comes back. And Hawking, through his very scientific discovery, left humanity with a beautiful metaphor. Sometimes, even at the darkest edge, silence is not yet absolute. That is why this part of his life carries such a deeply deep sleep of power resonance. For it is not merely an intellectual triumph. It is also a moment in which science becomes a spiritual lesson. A man whose body was steadily narrowing looked into the darkest object the human imagination had ever conceived, and found there not a final sentence, but a whisper. The more deeply we think about it, the more strangely fitting this discovery seems to Hawking's own life. His body, with the passing years, seemed to be moving towards silence, and yet his mind continued to emit something into the world. Like the black hole in his own discovery, outwardly a closing in. Yet at the edge of that closing, there remained a movement outward, something still wishing to be shared, a form of presence not yet willing to go out. Perhaps that is why Hawking radiation is not only an idea that bears his name. It also seems like a very deep mirror reflecting the man himself. But true science never lives by symbolic beauty alone. It also opens onto consequences, debates, and long corridors of continued thought. Hawking radiation immediately made black holes no longer a simple story. If a black hole can radiate and gradually lose mass, then what will ultimately happen to it? If something that once pulled inward, so completely that even light could not escape, can now whisper outward. Then where does information go? What remains preserved? What disappears? And what is the price of touching the deepest edge of understanding? From this point onward, too, the name Stephen Hawking began to move beyond the bounds of a promising researcher and into the larger corridor of the history of science. That discovery made him one of the central figures in modern black hole physics. It bound his name forever to one of the most beautiful and most shocking ideas of the 20th century. And once a person has touched such a summit, the natural world begins to regard them differently, no longer merely as a young scholar finding his way, but as someone taking a seat within the long current of minds that have made the universe less mysterious while still preserving all its wonder. As though after a very deep night, the lamp in an ancient academic room were beginning to illuminate more clearly a chair that already had its own history, the chair where older names had left behind a trace of warmth, waiting for someone new to sit down and continue the never-finished conversation with the sky. After an idea like Hawking radiation has sounded out in the scientific world, a human life does not immediately change, as it does in fairy tales. No bell rings to announce that from this moment on, a name has entered history. Most great transformations unfold more quietly than that. Fame comes after the work. Symbol comes after years of solitary labor. And sometimes, only in looking back, do people realize that someone has quietly stepped into a very long corridor of time. Stephen Hawking entered that corridor in just such a way. There are some geniuses who astonish the world through an explosive brilliance. But there are also geniuses who are placed into the current of history like a small but enduring flame, so that over the years people come to see that its light is not only enough to illuminate one corner of the room, but enough to connect centuries to one another. The chair of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge is precisely a symbol of that kind of continuity. First hearing, it is only an academic title, but in the spiritual life of British science and more broadly in the history of Western thought, it is something more than that. It is like a chair set in a room from which time has never fully departed. A seat not only for the living, but one that still carries the warmth of those who sat there before. Among them, the name that gives this chair a very particular light is Isaac Newton. When Newton is mentioned, many people immediately think of the apple, of gravity, of an intelligence able to look at the motion of the heavens and discover the law hidden beneath it. He was one of the first to make the universe less mysterious without stripping it of its grandeur. Newton did not destroy the wonder of the world. He simply gave humankind a new language with which to stand closer to it. And centuries later, Stephen Hawking, in a different way, did something similar. When Hawking held the Lucasian chair for many years, the story was not merely one of professional advancement. It carried a deeper meaning. A modern intellect had been placed exactly where the shadow of the past still remained strongly present. But shadow here does not mean a crushing weight. It is more like the faint outline of memory, reminding the person who sits down that before him, there were already those who had asked the greatest questions, and that his task is not to repeat them, but to continue the dialogue they left open. Hawking entered that position not as a copy of Newton. Its beauty lies in the fact that he was very different from Newton. Newton looked at the falling apple, at planetary orbits, at the mechanics of the visible world, and found a language that bound together the motions of heaven and earth. Hawking, by contrast, looked at black holes, singularities, radiation at the edge of darkness, places where physics no longer stands upon firm ground. If Newton helped humankind see that the universe has order, Hawking reminded us that, within that very order, there are still extreme regions that make all the old frameworks tremble. And it is in that difference that we truly see how beautiful the flow of science is. The history of intellect is not a procession of identical statues. It is a conversation stretching across centuries, in which each person who comes later is both indebted to the one before and also must possess enough courage to go farther than the earlier figure could stand. Hawking took his place in the chair once associated with Newton, not in order to remain forever beneath that shadow, but to do what every truly great mind must do: receive the inheritance, then turn it into a point of support, from which to look toward what the earlier generation could not yet see. Perhaps that is why this image feels so fitting for deep sleep of power. It gives us a feeling both solemn and warm. Genius does not stand outside time. Even someone as extraordinary as Hawking did not appear out of emptiness. He came from a tradition, walked through a corridor already filled with history, and sat down in a place where other minds before him had left the trace of their hands. That does not make him smaller. On the contrary, it makes his stature more human and more beautiful. For a great mind is not one that denies the past, but one that knows how to place itself within its long continuity. For older listeners, this is perhaps a detail that touches deeply. For after a full life, we understand that the deepest value does not always lie in what is new or loud. Some things are precious because they know how to continue. A roof passed down from one generation to the next. An old book bearing the handwriting of many hands. A chair in a family home upon which many generations have sat. The Lucasian chair carries something of that same feeling. An academic object, and at the same time a deeply human symbol of the transmission of the desire to understand. But one should not think that sitting in that chair made Hawking a man of ritual or of the past. On the contrary, it was precisely when he was placed within the long current of history that he emerged more clearly than ever as a man of the present, with an illness that was progressing, with a body increasingly in need of support, with an intellect that continued to expand toward new questions. That is what gives Hawking's image such a powerful paradox. He occupied a position symbolic of tradition, while he himself represented a very new form of presence in modern science. A physicist of black holes, a mind thinking at the edge of understanding, a human being whose bodily fragility did not prevent the reach of his vision. And here, the Lucasian chair suggests another quiet layer of meaning. It reminds us that genius, however great, still lives within time. Newton sat there and then departed. Hawking sat there, and one day he too would depart. No one keeps the chair forever, just as no one keeps the light of a life forever in the same form. What remains is not ownership, but the intellectual trace left behind in humanity's shared room. It is an idea both humble and beautiful. Even the greatest human beings are only overnight guests in the house of knowledge. But some pass through and leave warmth behind for longer. Hawking left behind such warmth, not only through his work, but through the very way he existed within the long current of science. He made the Lucasian chair evoke not only Newton, but another chapter in the dialogue between humanity and the universe. The chapter of black holes, of radiation, of the question of whether even in the darkest place, nature is still whispering something to us. And then, from that corridor of academic symbol, the story moves on into another region, where presence no longer means only sitting in the chair of history, but learning how to remain in the world when one's own body is listening less and less, as though after the echo of great titles, people began to notice another sound more clearly, a voice no longer entirely belonging to the natural human throat, yet one that would become one of the most recognizable signatures of an entire age. There are losses in human life that unfold very quietly. They do not come like a storm ripping a roof away in a single night, but like cold mist slowly seeping through the cracks of a door. A little each day, a little each year. Until when a person turns back to look, they realize that certain things once entirely natural have now become luxuries. Standing up on one's own, grasping with one's own hands, writing, speaking in the very voice that has been with one since the first years of life. For Stephen Hawking, ALS did not only narrow his ability to move, it also gradually took away something much deeper, the way a human being is present before the world. For we do not exist in the world through thought alone. We are present through our gaze, our gestures, our breathing, our hands, and above all, through our voice, the thing that comes from within us, yet reaches others like a bridge. A person may be very intelligent, very rich in inner life, very full of thought, but if they no longer have any way to bring those thoughts outward, they must live inside a very particular solitude, the solitude of an intellect that is still bright, while the door through which that brightness can emerge is slowly closing. That is what makes this part of Hawking's life so sorrowful and so beautiful. When his natural ability to speak declined severely, and then was almost entirely lost after a tracheotomy, the world may well have thought that this would be the moment his presence would begin to fade. That a scientist already living within a body growing more and more limited, now deprived as well of his voice, would surely recede from the shared space of humankind. But the remarkable thing is that Stephen Hawking did not accept disappearing in that way. He had to do something very rare in a human life: reinvent the very way he was present. At first hearing, that may sound like a matter of technology, but in its deeper layers, this is a story about dignity. The voice machine, associated with Hawking, later became a global symbol. For many people, just the first few electronic sounds were enough to make them recognize him. That voice was not soft, like an ordinary human voice. It did not carry the natural tremor of emotion, the subtle shifts of the vocal cords, the warmth of breath passing through the throat. It was a machine voice, steadier, colder, more metallic, and yet with time, that artificial voice itself became one of the most unforgettable sounds of the modern age. There is a very strange beauty in that. For life usually teaches us that to be truly present, we must retain our original, natural form. We are used to thinking that a real voice must be the one that comes out of our own throat, that a real face must be one that still moves easily, that a real body must be one that still responds smoothly. But Hawking compelled humanity to think otherwise. He showed that there are times when a person can still be present, very deeply, very clearly, even when the form of that presence has had to change completely. In other words, he reminds us that dignity does not lie entirely in the means. It lies in the way the spirit continues to go out into the world. To do that, Hawking had to rely on assistive communication technology and gradually use a system that allowed him to select words and form sentences through the tiny movements he still retained. Those who only looked from a distance might see this as a triumph of engineering. But if we look more closely, more slowly, we see that it was also a triumph of patience. For to speak a sentence when the body no longer obeys as it once did means that each word becomes a form of labor. Every thought that wishes to step outside must travel a far longer road than most healthy people could imagine. And yet he still spoke, still lectured, still answered, still joked, still debated, still brought his ideas before the public. There are forms of power that are easy to recognize. The power of position, of money, of crowds, of a loud voice. But Hawking's case shows us another kind of power, quieter, more enduring, and deeply suited to the spirit of deep sleep of power. The power of continuing to speak, even while one's physical life is retreating. That is not the kind of heroism that should be told in a voice too forceful. It should be told slowly, because its beauty lies in the detail. Imagine a thought arising in his mind. For most of us, that thought needs only a few seconds to become speech. But for Hawking, between thought and sound, there was an entire journey. A journey through machinery, through selection, through waiting. And it is within that journey that we see his intellect was not weakened because the instrument had become slower. On the contrary, at times that very slowness made his words carry even more weight. Each sentence seems to have passed through a stricter layer of choosing. Each statement feels distilled through difficulty. Perhaps that is why that artificial voice, though unnatural, carried such a real force of presence. It did not resemble an ordinary human voice, yet it carried something deeper even than vocal tone, the imprint of intellectual will. People were not moved by whether the sound was beautiful or harsh. They were moved by the truth that behind that electronic voice was a mind still at work, still thinking far ahead, still helping to widen humanity's horizon of understanding. For older listeners, this part of Hawking's life perhaps touches a very human ache. For the longer we live, the more we understand that age, illness, and weakness do not only take away strength, they also quietly touch identity. There may come a day when we suddenly realize that we no longer work as we once did, no longer speak as quickly as before, no longer inhabit the family or the world outside in the familiar form we once knew. And in that moment, the most painful question is not only what can I still do, but also who am I still if the way I am present has changed? Hawking did not answer that question through theory. He answered it through his life. He showed that a person can lose some of the older forms of the self without losing the core of dignity. We may have to learn again how to speak, how to work, how to connect with the world. But that does not automatically make our value smaller. Sometimes it is precisely the need to recreate the way we are present that reveals the most essential part of a human being. And from this point onward, Stephen Hawking was no longer only a theoretical physicist admired by the academic world. His image began to move deeply into the public imagination. The wheelchair, the thinning body, the electronic voice, the eyes still lit with alertness. All these came together into a symbol at once fragile and powerful. A person who seemed to have lost many of the ordinary physical means of life, and yet who was more present in public consciousness than ever before. That very paradox would open a new door. For when a mind like Hawking's no longer remained only in scientific papers, but began to enter living rooms, bookshelves, and the curiosity of ordinary people, then cosmology, too, was about to leave the professional corridors and move into the wider life of the world. As though, after learning how to speak through a machine, he was also about to find another way to make millions of people hear the echo of the stars within the small room of their own lives. There are books, that are not written merely to convey knowledge. They are written as a bridge. One end reaches toward realms of thought that are very distant, very high, very difficult to access. The other touches a small room where an ordinary person sits beneath a warm yellow light in the quiet of evening and suddenly feels a question arise that seemed to have long fallen asleep. How did this universe begin? A brief history of time is such a bridge. When Stephen Hawking wrote that book, he was not simply doing the work of a scientist. He was doing something rarer. He was opening a door. Before that, cosmology in the eyes of many resembled a castle built of symbols, equations, and debates for which only specialists possessed the key. Ordinary people could look up at the sky, could see the stars, the night, the great silence of space. But to move from admiration to understanding, the distance remained very great. Hawking seems to have seen that distance, and he was not willing to leave it standing like a wall. That is what gives the book its special beauty. It is not merely a summary of scientific ideas. It is an invitation very different from the tone that science sometimes carries without intending to. Dry, elevated, distant, and somewhat cold. Hawking wrote about time, black holes, the origin of the universe, the expansion of space, questions whose very names alone are enough to make many people hesitate. But he wrote with a clear awareness that the greatest questions should not remain locked forever inside lecture halls. They belong to humanity at large. They belong to the person who is living, growing older, and wondering where they themselves stand within this vastness. That is a very deep meaning of power, in the spirit of deep sleep of power. Power lies not only in knowing something great, but in the ability to share it in human language. For that reason, A Brief History of Time is not merely a famous book. It is the moment when Hawking stepped beyond the specialist world and became a guide for public curiosity. He did not make the universe smaller so that it would fit the reader. He kept its vastness intact, but tried to speak of it in a voice that made people dare to enter. That is an important difference. There are those who popularize knowledge by blurring its depth. Hawking did not do that. He did not betray the complexity of the universe. He merely tried to light a few more lamps along the road leading into it. Perhaps that is why this book became such a rare cultural phenomenon. A theoretical physicist, who by all expectation should have belonged only to academic halls, suddenly entered the living rooms of ordinary people, the bookshelves of families, the conversations of those who had never studied physics in depth. He went there with the same large questions he had long pursued, but now in a form that allowed millions to draw nearer without feeling turned away. That was a profoundly democratic act of intellect. For in the modern world, knowledge is sometimes turned into a kind of territory. Those who have studied more get to speak. Those inside the circle understand. Those outside can only stand and look on. Through this book, Hawking softened that boundary. He did not say that everyone would fully understand everything, but he quietly affirmed something beautiful. Everyone has the right to come near great questions. Whether you are a professor, a worker, a homemaker, a retiree, or a listener lying here with this story before sleep, the universe is still the common sky above us all. And for that reason, the questions about it should not be the privilege of only a few. There is something especially moving here, particularly for older listeners. After many years of living, we understand that what makes knowledge truly valuable is not only that it is correct, but that it can be passed on. A person who knows much but cannot find a way to speak to their fellow human beings is still like someone keeping light inside a locked room, but a person who knows how to open the door, how to lower their voice, how to turn something immense into language that can reach the hearts and minds of others. That person is doing work of a deeply human kind. Hawking did that through a very strange paradox. Precisely as his body became increasingly dependent on machines in order to be present, his voice among the public grew wider and wider. A man who had to use an electronic voice to speak about the greatest questions of the universe became a symbol of the meeting point between human fragility and the infinite breadth of intellect. Perhaps that, too, is why people did not read A Brief History of Time only for its content. They also read it because of the man behind it, a mind that continued to carry the world farther, even while his own body was growing more and more limited. That book also shows us something else important about Hawking. He did not only want to explore the universe, he also wanted others to enter that exploration with him. That is what carries him beyond the image of a purely academic scientist. He became a cultural figure, someone who helped move cosmology from the blackboard to the tea table, from scholarly papers into the rooms where ordinary people sat sipping warm tea and wondering about time. He made the story of science part of a broader spiritual life. Of course, that does not mean he was a person who was only gentle, approachable, or always eager to please the public. Hawking was not that. Behind that ability to open the door, there remained a very distinct personality. Sharp, witty, somewhat stubborn, at times even prickly. But perhaps that is exactly what makes his image feel more real. For the more deeply a person is loved by the public, the more carefully the storyteller must avoid turning them into a polished statue. And so, after seeing Hawking as the one who brought cosmology into humanity's living room, we will need to step even closer into the man himself, not only as a symbol, not only as the author of a best-selling book, but as a vividly alive personality, with dry laughter, with a pride of his own, with very human edges, as though, after the whole room has been opened to the night sky, the lamplight now slowly turns back toward the face of the one sitting beneath that sky, so that we may see more clearly the lines of a great soul that are not entirely smooth. After Stephen Hawking moved beyond the world of specialist lecture halls and became a familiar face to the public, there was one danger that could very easily arise. The real man might be obscured by the symbol. People saw the wheelchair, heard the electronic voice, remembered black holes, remembered A Brief History of Time, and little by little, almost without noticing, turned him into a statue of resilience and intellect. But statues, however beautiful, do not breathe. And what makes a figure truly endure in human memory is not only what they achieved, it is also the way they were present as a person, with a particular laugh, a particular difficulty, a particular self-respect, and even those rough edges that need not be polished smooth. Stephen Hawking was such a person. From a distance, it is easy to think that someone who lived for many years with severe illness would be remembered above all for endurance. But in Hawking's case, endurance is not the whole story. He did not live as a symbol of gentle resignation. There was always something sharper in him, more defiant, at times even faintly challenging. And it is precisely that which made him more real, more memorable, and also closer to actual human life. First of all, there was his sense of humor. It was not loud humor, and certainly not the kind of wit used merely to beautify an image. In Hawking there was a dry, fine, very British strain of humor, the kind of laughter that comes from a mind quick enough to recognize the ironies of life. Some people joke in order to escape reality. Hawking does not seem to have been like that. He joked as a way of standing upright before reality. When fate had placed him in a body growing more and more confined, he did not allow tragedy to hold exclusive rights over his voice. He kept for himself the right to speak with irony, with wit, and at times even with a smile edged by something sharp. That matters greatly, for humor, in Hawking's case, was not merely a trait of personality. It was dignity. It said that he did not wish to be seen simply as an object of pity. A person who still knows how to joke is still preserving a very deep kind of freedom. A person who can still look at adversity without surrendering the ability to smile at its absurdity is someone who has not allowed fate to define him entirely. And then there was his stubbornness. This is the quality that makes Hawking both admirable and deeply human. People with the strong inner force rarely move smoothly through life in a way that pleases everyone. They have views of their own, a rhythm of their own. There are moments when they are difficult, resistant, not always gentle according to social expectations. Hawking was like that as well. He was not the sort of figure made to satisfy everyone. He could be cutting, he could be obstinate, he could cling with remarkable persistence to what he believed was worth pursuing. But if we look more deeply, we can see that this stubbornness cannot be separated from the whole of his life. A person who had to live for decades in a body increasingly limited, yet still continue to work, continue to argue, continue to appear before the public, could scarcely have been soft in the structure of the inner self. To remain that long with science, with the world, with himself, Hawking almost had to possess a very hard core, and sometimes that core showed itself outwardly in the form of exacting standards, a strong temperament, a refusal to be bent too easily by the expectations of others. Perhaps it is precisely here that he becomes especially distinctive through the lens of deep sleep of power. For DSP does not need figures who are beautiful only in the sense of being smooth and complete. DSP needs human beings marked by the unevenness of real life, and Hawking had that. He was not a saint of resilience. He was a man of immense intelligence, but also of a strong ego, a pride of his own, and highly personal responses to a world that was looking at him. That pride was perhaps the third and most memorable layer of all. When we speak of pride here, we should not mean it in the sense of display or empty vanity. In Hawking, it was a very human kind of pride. He did not like being pitied, did not want his value reduced to his illness, did not accept being viewed merely as a story of overcoming hardship. He knew his physical fragility, but he also knew very clearly who he was in the realm of intellect, and he did not hide that awareness. This is an extraordinarily precious point, for society often treats the sick or the disabled with a kind of gentleness mixed with unconscious diminishment. People feel sympathy, but also easily forget that before them still stands a complete personality, with self-respect, with the right to be irritated, to argue, to possess an ego. Hawking seems always to have resisted that flattening gaze. He did not want to be reduced to an inspiration. He wanted to be recognized as a thinker, a scientist, a human being with full dignity. And perhaps that is precisely why he touched the public more deeply. For he did not merely move people emotionally, he also commanded their respect. The difference between those two things is very great. Emotion may arise from pity, but respect comes only when we feel that before us stands a person who refuses to diminish himself, in order to be more easily loved. All these traits, humor, stubbornness, pride, draw Hawking back out from behind the glass of symbol. He becomes once more a vividly living person, someone who could make others feel affection, admiration, and at times even a certain distance from him. But it is exactly that mixture that creates the truthfulness of a great portrait. Those who leave deep marks in history are rarely people who are entirely easy to live with. They usually carry a force of their own so strong that if one stands too near, one feels both its warmth and its sharpness. For older listeners, this is perhaps a part of the story that invites easy recognition. For after a long life, we understand that human dignity does not lie in always being gentle, always pleasing others, always fitting the model of kindness. Sometimes, dignity lies in daring to preserve a part of one's own selfhood, even when life has taken away so many other things. Hawking gradually lost the ability to move freely, lost his natural voice, lost a great many forms of physical freedom, but he did not lose the distinctive tone of his soul. That is an immensely precious thing, and because he was such a real and forceful personality, his scientific life could never be only a journey of discoveries with which everyone agreed from the very beginning. A mind as sharp as his, an ego as strong as his, entering into the greatest questions of physics would almost inevitably bring controversy with it. Like a stone dropped into a lake that had seemed still, the rings spreading outward would not only catch the light, but also reveal the more complicated undercurrents beneath the surface. When a human being has gone deeply enough into the darkest regions of knowledge, they will almost certainly not emerge without carrying controversy with them. For at the edge of understanding, where the map is still unfinished and the old language begins to falter, science rarely advances through gentle consensus. It moves forward through questions that unsettle other people, through ideas that make an entire generation pause, respond, revise, even argue for many years. Stephen Hawking, with all his sharpness and persistence, lived fully within that climate. And perhaps this is one of the most beautiful parts through which to understand him as a truly serious scientist. For outsiders, sometimes imagine science as a brightly lit road. Whoever is right prevails. Whoever is wrong steps back, and truth simply appears one rung at a time. But the real life of thought is not so smooth, especially when the object of thought is the black hole, where light does not easily return, where extreme gravity makes many old laws tremble, where even the word "no" itself becomes more fragile. There, every great question is like a stone dropped into the surface of a lake at night. The first sound may be small, but the ripples spread for a very long time. One of the largest ripples associated with Hawking was the question of information. Hearing that word, many people may immediately think of modern life, data, messages, images, computers. But in physics, information here is deeper and far more foundational. It concerns this: if we know the complete state of a physical system, do the laws of nature allow that information to disappear completely? Put more plainly, is the universe a place where something can be erased so thoroughly that no trace remains at all? Or is everything, in some way, still preserved? This is not a small question. It touches the foundations of how human beings understand reality. And it is the black hole that made that question so sharp. If an object falls into a black hole, what happens to all the information about it? If the black hole simply swallows it in and then through Hawking radiation gradually evaporates away, does that mean what once fell in is lost from the universe altogether? If so, many foundational principles of quantum physics would be severely shaken. But if not, then where did the information go, and how does it return from a realm that seems so completely silent? That is where the great debate arose. The beauty of this part lies here. It shows that Hawking was not someone sitting on a summit and speaking only in certainties. He was a mind willing to put forward conclusions of great disruptive force, and then willing to live inside the zone of argument those very conclusions created. There was a time when Hawking's position led many physicists to believe that information really could be lost in a black hole. Later, after many years of debate and reconsideration, he adjusted his own view. To the public, changing one's mind may be mistaken for weakness. But to true science, it is in fact a very strong quality, the ability to remain more loyal to truth than to ego. This is worth pausing over very slowly. For a great intellect is not one that is never wrong, nor one that never revises itself. A great intellect is one strong enough to go to the deep edge of a question, sharp enough to propose a bold hypothesis, and honest enough to look again when the picture needs to change. Hawking lived exactly in that way. He did not avoid the zone of uncertainty. He stayed with it, argued through it, even allowed himself to be tested by it over many years. For older listeners, this is perhaps a lesson that sinks in deeply. After a full life, we understand that the things that truly matter rarely hand us tidy answers at once. Great problems, in science, in family life, in the inward life, often require us to live with what is unclear for a very long time. Some questions must be circled for years before their true shape begins to appear. And sometimes, what makes a person grow is not grasping a complete answer from the beginning, but having enough patience to continue a dialogue with what one does not yet understand. In Hawking, within the debates over black holes and information, we see precisely such a person. Here, too, we see clearly the price of thinking at the edge of knowledge. That price is not only intellectual effort, it is also the need to accept living without entirely firm ground beneath one's feet. When thinking about the ordinary regions of reality, human beings still have everyday intuition as a companion. But at the edge of knowledge, intuition often betrays us. We must feel our way forward through mathematics, through hypothesis, through debate with minds no less brilliant than our own. That is both exhilarating and exhausting. It demands not only intelligence, but also a rare inward endurance. And Hawking paid that price. With the very life of his intellect, he did not stand outside disagreement. He stepped into it, at times very publicly, very forcefully, even through the now famous bets within the scientific world. Such things make him feel very human, for science, at its deepest level, is not a land of perfectly cold minds without emotion. It also has pride, has wagers won and lost, has the joy of proving what one believes, has the irritation of being challenged, and also the beauty of great minds pushing one another forward. That is why debate in science is not necessarily a sign of disorder. Very often it is a sign of life. A field that is still arguing is a field that is still breathing. Black holes, information, evaporation, quantum paradoxes. All these things keep modern physics from becoming a museum of framed certainties, and instead make it a room with many doors not yet fully opened. And Stephen Hawking helped keep that room charged. In the spirit of deep sleep of power, this is a very particular kind of beauty. Some questions are so large that even great minds cannot bend them neatly into shape in a single night. They must circle them, return to them, argue with one another about them, even live for years in their shadow. And that very incompleteness makes science feel closer to human life. For in the end, science is not the absolute possession of truth. It is the journey of finite beings trying to understand a reality larger than themselves. Hawking understood that, even if he did not always say it in such a gentle way. He thought boldly, spoke sharply, argued persistently. But beneath those disagreements there remained a deep loyalty to the question itself. He wanted to know what truly happens at the edge of a black hole. He wanted to understand what nature was hiding behind the curtain of darkness. And to go that far, he accepted paying the price of prolonged uncertainty. Perhaps this is also where we see more clearly Hawking's own peculiar paradox. His body became ever more dependent, yet his mind continued to dwell in the freest regions of thought. As the years passed, that body grew smaller within physical space, yet the debates in which he took part grew wider within humanity's mental world, as though while his hands and footsteps increasingly had to rely on others, his vision still kept moving farther away, upward toward questions with no protective railing. And then, after many such years, people began to recognize a strange and beautiful image. There are some human beings who, the more limited they become in the movements of daily life, the more they widen the boundaries of imagination for the rest of the world. Like a lamp set inside a cage, growing narrower and narrower, whose light still quietly reaches farther with every passing night. There are paradoxes in human life that need no embellishment because they are already moving enough in themselves. With Stephen Hawking, one of those paradoxes grew clearer with the passing years. His body became smaller within the physical world, yet his vision within the imagination of humankind kept widening. To the ordinary eye, one would see a man who increasingly needed more support in order to live, to move, to communicate. But to the eye of intellectual history, one would see the opposite. It was precisely this limited man who was expanding the boundaries of understanding for millions of others. This is a kind of beauty very difficult to tell without slipping into easy sentiment. For Hawking's story should not be turned into a simple song about willpower triumphing over fate. That way of telling it is too quick, too flat, and unfair to the true depth of his life. What made Hawking great was not that he rose above illness in the manner of a slogan. It was that he lived alongside the narrowing of his body for a very long time, in a way that was very real, very tangible, very far from easy. And within that very process, he continued the work of the mind with a rare degree of concentration. As time went on, Hawking's physical life became more and more dependent on others, on devices, on the continuous rhythm of care from a support system around him. This is perhaps what outsiders often forget when they see only the symbolic image. We easily remember the electronic voice, the wheelchair, the lectures, the famous photographs. But behind those images was a very concrete daily life. A body that obeyed less and less, every movement requiring more and more mediation, each passing day becoming a new lesson in limitation. And limitation, as anyone who has lived through illness or age knows, does not burden only the body. It quietly touches one's self-respect, one's sense of self, the way a person understands their place in the world. There are days when one can no longer open a door as before. Days when one can no longer walk to a writing desk as before. Days when everything once natural becomes a carefully arranged sequence. Such things do not make for dramatic scenes on a screen, but in real life, they are tiny grains of sand that wear a person down day after day. Stephen Hawking lived within that wearing down for many decades, and perhaps that is precisely why his spiritual stature became all the clearer. For while his physical life was contracting, he did not respond by shrinking his imagination to fit the part of the body that remained. He did not say, "Because I can no longer travel far, I will think only of things close at hand." On the contrary, he turned ever more toward the widest questions about the universe, about time, about black holes, about beginnings and endings, as though a deep awareness of his own limits made him even more sensitive to the great boundaries of reality itself. That is a very deep lesson for listeners today. In the modern world, we often associate freedom with movement, going where we wish, doing what we like, having a healthy body that allows us to pass quickly through life. All those things are, of course, precious. But Hawking reminds us that there is another layer of freedom, more difficult, perhaps, and perhaps more enduring: the freedom of the intellect. A person may lose many forms of physical independence and still keep the ability to ask questions, the ability to think, the ability to look beyond the narrow portion of life enclosing them. And in Hawking's case, that layer of freedom became his greatest sky. Because of that, Hawking's image in the public imagination gradually moved beyond the boundaries of a particular scientist. He became a symbol of something very strange, an embodiment of fragility, yet one that does not evoke helplessness, a body dependent on machines, yet one that makes others think of the freest realms of thought. Perhaps not many figures in the 20th and early 21st centuries carried within themselves a paradox so powerful. In him, physical limitation did not destroy spiritual power. It made that power appear more clearly. Of course, this must be said very gently and very clearly. This does not mean illness is a gift, or that pain in itself gives birth to intelligence. No, illness remains loss. Dependence remains difficult. The weakening of the body should not be romanticized. Deep sleep of power does not tell Hawking's story in order to turn suffering into a kind of spiritual ornament. We tell it in order to see that a human being can live very truthfully within loss, without allowing loss to define the whole depth of who they are. That is a very important distinction. For older listeners, this perhaps touches a particular layer of feeling. For as age passes through us, many begin to face that very paradox in different ways. The body is no longer as quick as before. Memory sometimes needs to slow down. Strength no longer answers immediately as it once did. And within those changes, one can easily feel oneself becoming smaller in the world. But Hawking leaves behind a very gentle reminder. A person may grow smaller on one level and still grow larger on another. A shorter step does not necessarily mean a narrower vision. A slower day does not mean the soul must become shallower. Perhaps that is what made him so deeply loved. Not only because of his scientific works, not only because of his famous remarks, but because the image of his life became a living metaphor for so many people. When they looked at Hawking, they saw a truth both painful and beautiful. The surface layer of life may contract, yet depth may still continue to open. And sometimes, it is precisely when one loses many of the ordinary means of being present that one is forced to find what is most essential within oneself. This is also where we see clearly the difference between fame and legacy. Fame may come from the public remembering a face, a name, a few remarks, but legacy is deeper. It is the way one human being changes the way others look at life. Hawking did that. He made people think differently about black holes, about time, about the universe. But at the same time, he also made people think differently about limitation, about dignity, about the possibility of continuing to live meaningfully when the body is no longer an easy ally. The more we look back, the more we see that Stephen Hawking was not only a man who spoke about distant horizons, he himself was a horizon for others to look toward, a horizon where fragility and greatness exist together, where dependence does not erase dignity, where the finitude of the body makes all the more visible the infinite longing of the intellect. And for that reason, as the story moves slowly toward its close, we cannot stop at merely repeating his achievements. We must ask more deeply, in the end, what is it in Hawking that will remain longest with humanity? The formulas, the symbol, or the way he taught us to lift our heads amid the limits of human life, as though looking through a narrow window and still seeing the whole night sky opening beyond it. When a human being passes through life with a stature like Stephen Hawking's, what remains in the end is rarely only a list of achievements. The achievements, of course, matter greatly. Science needs results that can be named, ideas that can be placed into history, advances that alter the picture of the universe. But with Hawking, if we keep only the names of the theories, the debates, the prestigious chairs, or the famous books, then we are still holding only the frame. The deeper light of his life lies elsewhere. He did not only contribute to how humanity understands the universe, he also taught humanity how to lift its head and look at the universe even amid the very human limits of life. That is a softer kind of legacy, yet a more enduring one. We may think of Hawking's legacy as 3 concentric circles, spreading outward from a very small point, yet reaching very far. The first circle is his scientific legacy. Here, his name is bound to the greatest questions of modern physics, singularities, black holes, Hawking radiation, the tension between gravity and quantum theory, the paradoxes of information. Whether the listener remembers every detail or not, what matters is this: Hawking helped bring humanity closer to the most extreme frontiers of understanding. He did not choose the easy questions. He entered regions where the map of physics begins to tear, where even brilliant minds must slow their steps. And in doing so, he left science not only a few conclusions, but an entire way of seeing. The courage to remain beside the darkest things. The courage to keep thinking when everyday intuition has reached its end. But if we stop only at that circle, Hawking would still belong chiefly to specialists. What carries him farther lies in the second circle, his symbolic legacy. A man once predicted to live only a short time, continued to work for many decades. A body growing ever more dependent on machines became the home of one of the most recognizable intellects of the age. An electronic voice which might have made people feel distant instead became a sign of spiritual closeness for millions. That is Hawking's beautiful paradox. He did not conquer illness by erasing it. He lived through it, and in that process became a symbol of intellectual dignity. This symbol touched the public deeply because it was not false. It was not built out of easy slogans. It was built out of many very real years, many limitations, many dependencies, many concrete difficulties. And for that reason, when people looked at Hawking, they did not see only a great scientist. They saw a man reminding them that the value of a human life does not lie entirely in the smooth functioning of the body, but in the depth of the spirit one is still able to preserve. Then from those two circles, the third legacy opens, perhaps the gentlest circle, yet the one that spreads the farthest, his cultural legacy. Hawking did not only do science, he also did something that not every great scientist manages to do. He brought science into the spiritual life of ordinary people. He made questions about time, the origin of the universe, black holes, beginnings and endings, cease to belong only to academic halls. He brought them nearer to the small room of the reader, the listener, the person living a very ordinary life, yet still carrying within a very ancient longing, the longing to know where one stands in this vast picture. This is something profoundly precious, for in many ages, great knowledge has stood too far from ordinary people. It has resembled a lamp hung too high, so that those below could see its brightness but never touch it. Hawking, through books, through talks, through the image of his own life, lowered that lamp a little, not by making it shine less, but by making others feel less afraid to stand near it. He made it possible for a person who had never studied physics to ask about the universe without feeling improper before, something too immense. He allowed curiosity to become a shared human right, rather than the privilege of a few. For older listeners, this is perhaps the layer of legacy that sinks in most deeply. For after a long life, people do not ask only what is true, but also what is worth keeping. And what is worth keeping is often not achievement in the sense of accomplishment alone. It is also a way of living, a way of seeing, a spiritual tone. Hawking left behind exactly that kind of legacy. He taught people that one may keep curiosity alive all the way to the end of the journey, that one may still ask great questions without needing to be young, healthy, or perfect, that one may still lift one's head to the sky, even when one's private life is full of limitation. There is a very deep sleep of power kind of beauty here. Stephen Hawking did not teach humanity to look up through a voice of exhortation. He taught through the very fact of his existence. A man almost motionless, yet causing millions to move in imagination. A man so often held back within the physical room of his body, yet making humanity feel that the sky had grown wider than before. That is a very rare form of power. Not forcing, not dominating, not noisy, simply and quietly widening the spiritual horizon of others. And perhaps that is what will remain the longest. There will be theories further refined. Debates will continue. Future generations of physicists will go farther in places where Hawking once stopped. That is the natural rhythm of science. But even when equations change, the spiritual image Hawking left behind will be difficult to erase. The image of a man who refused to let the finitude of the body determine the breadth of the questions he dared to hold. The image of an intellect that did not look at the universe as a distant stage, but as a gentle yet demanding invitation addressed to every human being capable of thought. In the end, Hawking's deepest legacy perhaps does not lie in how many questions he answered. It lies in the fact that he made humanity less afraid of great questions. He made the darkness of the universe suggest not only devouring, but curiosity. He made immensity feel not only like something that makes us small, but also like something that makes us fortunate, because we are still able to ask. And when a human being leaves behind for the world the ability to lift its head in that way, then the final night of the story cannot be only a farewell. It must also be a pause in which we carry that legacy back into the age in which we ourselves are living. An age of noise, flashing signals, and anxieties that move faster than breath. as though after looking up at the sky with Hawking, we slowly lower our gaze again toward the present years and ask whether amid all the noise of 2026, there is still a light from this story gentle enough to guide the human heart. Let your breathing slow a little, slow like the lamp in your room being turned down by one small notch, bright enough to show the way, gentle enough that the heart does not need to stay awake too long. Breathe in, as though inviting peace to step inside. Breathe out, as though gently seeing your tensions out the door, light as a leaf leaving its branch on a windless night. And now, as the story has nearly completed its circle, we return to 2026, our age. An age full of screen light, full of alarms, full of news moving faster than breath itself. An age in which human beings can know a great deal very quickly, and yet find it hard to keep a single thought with them long enough for it to ripen into wisdom. An age in which attention is torn into fragments, and dignity is easily measured by speed, image, efficiency, and outward smoothness. In such an age, Stephen Hawking leaves us not only a scientific legacy, he leaves us a very strange lullaby, one that does not lull people into sleeping through the world, but lulls them into calmness so they may look at the world more deeply. The first lesson Hawking offers to 2026 is perhaps this: limitation does not automatically erase value. Our age is very quick to make people panic in the face of imperfection, to be only a little slower, a little weaker, a little different from the standard being magnified on the screen is enough to make us feel left behind. There are those who carry illness. There are those who are growing old. There are those who no longer speak quickly, walk quickly, or work quickly as before. There are those who feel themselves becoming less and less smooth in a world that worships flawless functioning. Stephen Hawking reminds us that human worth does not lie entirely in the smoothness of the body or the surface of life. He lived for many decades in a body that became increasingly limited, and yet from that very place, which seemed to be narrowing, he expanded the imagination of humankind. This does not mean pain is beautiful or illness is a gift. No. Limitation is still a limitation. Loss is still loss. But Hawking shows us this: when one physical door closes, human dignity does not therefore close with it. There remains another sky, the sky of questions, of thought, of inner depth. For older listeners, this may be the gentlest comfort of all. Age often makes a person feel that they are growing smaller before the world. But Hawking whispers something different. We may grow smaller on one level and still grow larger on another. A body that moves more slowly does not mean a soul has become poorer. A more tiring day does not mean the mind has lost its ability to see far. The second lesson Hawking leaves to an age of turbulence is this: knowledge is most beautiful when it is spoken in human language. The year 2026 is an age flooded with data. Human beings can reach endless amounts of information with only a few touches of the hand. But the more data there is, the more easily we fall into a new paradox. We know more scattered fragments, yet understand less. We hear more, yet absorb less. We read very quickly, yet think very shallowly. It is precisely in this setting that Hawking's image becomes even more important. He did not only study the universe, he also tried to bring cosmology out from behind the walls of academia and toward ordinary people. He did this not by making knowledge cheap, but by making it possible to enter. This is a great lesson for our age. Understanding truly has power only when it can be shared without losing its soul. A great idea should not be locked away in rooms that only specialists can enter, just as a person rich in life experience should not keep the wisdom of that life shut away like something under lock and key. Hawking teaches us that the greatest thing is not to stand high above and look downward, but to lower one's voice a little, so that others may also look upward beside us. In a world of too much noise, this is precious. We do not lack people who speak. We lack people who truly explain. We do not lack information. We lack the bridges that connect information to wisdom. And Hawking, through his life and his books, became such a bridge. The third lesson, and perhaps the most beautiful of all, is this. Darkness is not always the ending. Perhaps no image suits 2026 more than this one. We are living in an age where anxiety spreads quickly. Bad news travels far. Algorithms pull human attention toward extremes: anger, fear, comparison, exhaustion. Many people live among all kinds of inward black holes: sleeplessness, stress, loneliness, illness, the feeling of being swallowed by a cycle with no end. And it is here that Hawking radiation becomes such a beautiful metaphor for modern life. Hawking looked into what people imagine to be absolute blackness, absolute silence, and discovered that even at the darkest edge, there was still a whisper, a leakage, a small signal, a possibility not yet fully extinguished. It is hard to find a gentler image to offer people today before sleep. Not everyone can immediately end their worries. Not everyone can step out of the darkness surrounding them at once. But perhaps everyone needs to hear this. If your life today feels very weary, very narrow, very full of darkness, that may not yet be the whole story. Sometimes, even at the darkest edge, a very small light may already be beginning to leak through. A phone call asking how you are, an evening quieter than usual, a story like tonight's, a thought softening, a faith not yet entirely gone out. In the end, Stephen Hawking did not leave 2026 a slogan. He leaves a way of living. Hold fast to the great questions, hold fast to dignity, and do not be too quick to believe that darkness has spoken the final word. And so, as tonight slowly closes, we may let the story of him settle into our hearts like a quiet star, not so bright that it keeps us awake, only bright enough to remind us that amid the countless disturbances of the world, human beings may still live more slowly, more deeply, and lift their heads one more time.